So I'm going to go ahead and get started here in the interest of time. Again, this is Andrew Conley with Clean Fuels Ohio. I'm the program director here. Also joined by Sandra Loy from NREL and Alan Harnett. This training for Clean Cities Coalition consulting programs is brought to you on behalf of NREL in support of the US DOE Clean Cities program through their mentoring initiative. They are funding a partnership between Clean Fuels Ohio and Virginia Clean Cities to bring this training to coordinators. Today we're going to provide a broad overview of what these kind of programs are, what they look like, and how they can help your coalition, as well as information about the key components that you need to set up such a program. So again, before I move on from this slide, folks who want to join us on the interactive audio portion, please dial that 605 number and that passcode, and you can interact live audio for the Q&A portion at the end. So today's agenda, we're going to look at these consulting services programs from a couple of different angles. First, we're going to look at why create a consulting services program. What are the benefits for the coalition? What are the benefits for your stakeholders? Second, we're going to look at the types of consulting service programs. So there are a wide variety of different things that coalitions can offer on a fee-for-service or revenue basis. But then we're going to take a deeper dive into the main area of focus here, which is fleet analysis and planning services. Beyond that, we're going to look at, from a very high level today, key steps to creating a consulting services program for each coalition. And we're also going to touch on more detail about next steps, deeper dive resources available at the Coordinator Peer Exchange coming up at the end of August. Specifically a session dedicated to this on August the 24th, as well as what we're terming deeper dive webinars on 3 core topics around consulting services that will be presented in a series 3 different weeks in September. So with that, we can just dive into our agenda. So obviously there are about 90 Clean Cities coalitions, a diverse set of coalitions across the country offering stakeholders a great range of services. And so consulting can be an integrated part of coalition activities designed to really further our mission as Clean Cities coalitions. And that's why the DOE, NREL, and then a number of our specific coalitions have interest in this topic area and why this training was determined relevant for everyone. So obviously, as Clean Cities coalitions, we are working with fleets to deploy cost-effective, sustainable fuels, technologies, and planning solutions. These type of consulting services fit well within that mission and can provide a number of benefits for a coalition and our stakeholders. So to review those in a little more detail, consulting services programs can really provide in-depth analysis and planning for stakeholders or fleets. So really better serve, provide more value to our fleet stakeholders as coalitions. They can also better position Clean Cities coalitions as the local go-to experts around fuels and technologies. So really certify and more formally show your expertise. And then kind of on the back end of the organization outlook, they can provide a revenue source and a profit base for the coalition. So as public, state, federal, and local grants kind of wax and wane, as private foundation funding waxes and wanes, these can provide a more stable base for seeking revenue outside of the ins and outs of federal and state grant dollars. And so then the goal, obviously, because of that additional revenue base, the goal is to make a coalition more organizationally sustainable, have that additional funding base. So from both adding value to stakeholders and fleets, furthering our mission, as well as making our organizations more sustainable, those are some of the key reasons to look at creating a consulting services program at your local coalition. So in terms of consulting services, I did mention these. On August the 24th, we will have a session at the Peer Exchange from 3:30 to 5 p.m. And Sandra and the folks at planning that Peer Exchange event do ask that you register for that session by July the 26th, if possible, to give them a good feel of who's interested and planning to attend. So if you do attend on that day, what we will be looking to do is provide some success stories from other coalitions who are performing these types of consulting services projects. We'll also be looking to provide some tools and exercises that I will reference on this call today, but that would be a place where we can actually roll up our sleeves and work on those. And then today's topics will be broken into three main categories around what kind of organizational structure you need to develop a consulting services program, how do you scope and contract and perform a consulting services project for a client, and then how do you market and outreach a program like this so that you can get more clients. So today we'll kind of focus on those three core areas at the high level, but on September 7th, 14th, and 21st, so on the Thursdays in September, we'll be providing a deeper dive into each of those areas with additional templates, tools, and exercises so that you can really begin to do some of this work on the outset so you're ready whenever a client opportunity presents itself. So with that, as I've mentioned previously, there are a range of consulting services that coalitions can perform. Fleet analysis and planning work has really been the biggest draw and demand for us at Clean Fuels Ohio, as well as from other coalitions like Virginia Clean Cities and others that we know of around the country. So most of these consulting services trainings will focus on how to better prepare for fleet analysis and planning services. However, there are a wider range of services coalitions can offer, and a number of the templates and tools that we'll provide will help you get in a better position to quote costs and scope and contract for these if you choose to spin them in these directions. But other areas include grant writing for fleets and stakeholders and partners, or helping them secure incentives, market research, looking into the potential demand for certain technologies or stations or what have you in your territory, government affairs, if there's any policy work that you see barriers or other incentives that need to be put in place on your local level or state level. Government affairs work can be done on a fee-for-service basis. Events and communications, so hosting station opening events or other training or outreach events for industry or fleets or other stakeholders, and working to develop bids and solicitations, or creating that as a benefit as part of a package that you're working with for people. So there are a wider variety of these, but again, for the purposes of today and the deeper dives that we're going to take, we're really going to focus on fleet analysis and planning, as that is most squarely within the Clean Cities mission and most relevant to the widest number of coordinators based on some surveys we've done and other background research that we've done. So with that, I thought it would be important to give folks an understanding of what a fleet analysis and planning project may entail. So I'm going to speak to this primarily from Clean Fuels Ohio's experience, but that doesn't mean this is the only way to do a project like this. But in general terms, fleet analysis and planning project would include the following 5 components that I'm going to go over. So the first is a need to understand whatever fleet client, whether it's a public or private fleet, a need to understand their fleet operations. And in order to understand their fleet operations, you obviously have to gather baseline data on a fleet. So the types of baseline data that we've usually gathered encompass 3 core areas. The first area is inventory and usage data. So looking at what makes and models of vehicles a fleet has, what is the annual fuel use and annual miles of those makes and models, so we understand what their inventory and usage is. The second area of baseline data that we typically gather is refueling practices data. Does the fleet fuel at one central location and all vehicles fuel at that location? Does the fleet have multiple fuel depots spread across the region? Or does it have fleet cards that the different operators go out and fuel at whatever station is closest to their route whenever they need it? Understanding their fueling practices and understanding if there's any key days of the week or hours of the day where there's a huge demand for fueling, so you can better understand their practices, what kind of capacity they need if they are building an alternative fuel station. And the third area of baseline data that we typically gather is some information on the fleet's replacement cycle or replacement plan. Does that fleet not purchase vehicles at all every year and only purchase them in a couple big batches? Do they purchase a steady stream of vehicles, a handful each year? How does that fleet work to replace their vehicles? What we find is usually the most cost-effective way for fleets to move forward is to incorporate alternative fuels or efficiency technologies into their new vehicle purchases. Even if they do have the ability to convert some of their existing vehicles, they will likely, if they are deploying alternative fuel vehicles, work that into their replacement cycle. So knowing the scale and the typical types of vehicles that are replaced on an annual basis is very helpful for understanding that. And with that data, what we typically do is create a baseline performance assessment. So look at some key performance indicators. How many sedans do they have? How many half-ton pickup trucks? How many medium duty? How many heavy duty? What is the typical fuel use and MPG and cost per mile for some of these based on the data that folks provide, so that we can establish a nice snapshot of their current fleet operations, as well as use that as a benchmark to gauge future deployments, hypothetical or potential deployments of alternative fuel vehicles again. So then, kind of simultaneous with gathering data on the fleet operations, we need to gather information about the fleet's criteria, their priority criteria for analysis and their goals. Here in Ohio, I usually frame it as we don't have mandates, we don't have incentives, we don't have a lot of regulations that are forcing fleets to change their practices. We don't have incentives that are really catalyzing those changes. So in Ohio, most of the fleets that we've worked with have really dealt with what's the business case, what's the return on investment, what can save us the most money. But there's been notable examples where fleets have put environmental goals first and foremost. We've worked with some solid waste districts and some universities that have put in aggressive carbon reduction goals. And the key to them in these consulting projects was, how can I meet my carbon reduction goal? That's the first and foremost, what gets me there, and then factor in cost effectiveness to the extent relevant after that. So establishing goals and knowing how you're going to evaluate, how you're going to analyze options based on the fleet-specific goals is very important. And then third, what we tend to look at is providing some background information on some of the high-level pros and cons of the different fuels, but really looking at, based on their fleet inventory and usage and practices, what options are commercially available for those types of units and the types of drive and duty cycles that they have. What are the likely operational cost savings that they would have given their current routes and usage rates? So looking at specific vehicle costs, conventional versus alternative fuel, charting out performance based on any MPG differences and other differences in performance or maintenance and what have you, and then charting out what are there operational savings available for these alternative fuel vehicles. We usually look at vehicle operational savings first, because if you're not going to get operational savings on a vehicle, it's not worth even looking at the further investments that a fleet would need in stations, facilities, or training. So we usually assess vehicle operations savings, and if there are positive savings, then we look at what else a fleet would need to implement those vehicles in. Do they need to invest in a station? Do they need to invest in facilities modifications for, gaseous fuel detection or what have you? And then look at the total investment picture and look at what the return on investment profile would be for that scenario of deployment of alternative fuels. We also tend to like to incorporate, and have found it useful for fleets to incorporate several different scenarios. So we have usually included a low, medium, and high oil price reference case with data that the Energy Information Administration provides. The EIA creates their annual energy outlook, and they chart out fuels for a couple of decades into the future. So we usually tend to review things on a 10-year time frame and look at how the scenarios play out in terms of whether fuel prices increase, decrease, or roughly stay the same. And fleets have reported that that's been very helpful for them. And so in terms of that, then we would chart out those total return on investment pictures for fleets and really give them a sense of where, when, and how that their vehicle operations would fit with alternative fuel use and what the potential savings and environmental benefits would be. And then based on that detailed analysis, provide them with the according detailed recommendations for replacement and transition of their vehicles to alternative fuels. So that's kind of the broad scope of analysis. Obviously, not every coalition has to do all of that every time. We haven't done all of that every time. There's a lot of tailoring it to client-specific needs. Sometimes a client will say, this kind of alternative fuel station is now publicly available near me. I just want to look at this kind of fuel only. Or others will say, tell me the whole spectrum of options available to me. So as I mentioned on the call we had earlier today, there's a little bit of an art and a science to some of these consulting projects. It's a bit of a transition from a kind of grant-oriented perspective, where when I came on board with Clean Fuels Ohio, we were almost exclusively grant-funded, and those projects were very process-oriented. You proposed a certain scope of work, the grantor expected that scope and that scope only. You perform that scope in the time frame. It was all very cut and dried. Whereas, and I'll probably circle back to this again, but a lot of these consulting projects, you basically have a client or a customer at the end of the day. And so there is a little bit more back and forth along the kind of customer's always right level. So, you have to look at tailoring things to that client's interest, but also have a balanced perspective in not providing too much or allowing the customer to change the scope midterm, mid-project. So there's a bit of a kind of philosophical change that occurs when you're dealing with a client more than a grantor. With that said, one of the big reasons that we're offering these services and that NRA was interested us to offer these trainings was because a number of coalitions have either launched these programs or have expressed interest in launching these programs. So we wanted to make sure we equip folks with the basics of what they need to get going. Virginia Clean Cities and Clean Fuels Ohio have done some individual mentoring contracts in the past with individual coalitions. And what I've found from my own experience personally bringing this online with Clean Fuels Ohio is, a client will come up, you'll be working with a fleet stakeholder and they'll say, hey, can you do these kind of consulting services? And you say, yes, we can. But then as soon as you start getting into it, you realize, well, there's a lot of background information and due diligence and kind of organizational structure and different things that we need to have in place to orient our coalition towards this type of business model, which is a little different than perhaps what you've done in the past. So the goal of this training program is to help kind of get all those boxes checked, get all those pieces on the board so that when a potential client arrives, when that opportunity for a consulting services project arrives, any coalition has what they need to say yes and move forward. So with that said, there are these three core areas of groundwork that needs to be laid. And I'm going to go through these at a very high level right now. And again, we will have time for some Q&A on the back end of this conversation, as well as some time to do a deeper dive at the peer exchange, as well as through 3 more webinars in September. So if you feel like I'm covering something at too high of a level now, we welcome you and encourage you to join us for those deeper dives going forward. But in terms of the organizational groundwork, you really need to get what I'm calling the green light here. You need to figure out who needs to have input, what kind of input you need to have to make sure you've done your due diligence on the organizational side. So, most coalitions have a board of directors that would need to weigh in and approve these kinds of projects. One of the templates that we'll provide is some kind of resolution language or template there if you want to have your board formally approve your work in doing fee-for-service projects. At Clean Fuels Ohio, we actually got opinions from an auditor and a law firm as to, as a 501c3 nonprofit, would this affect our tax exempt status? Is there a specific threshold within our organizational budget that we need to not exceed in order not to be taxed on the revenue that we would make from fee-for-service? These kinds of very specific technical questions. Other organizations, other coalitions are housed within state agencies or metropolitan planning organizations or universities. Is there anything that, as a coalition, you need to double check or get the go-ahead from one of those umbrella organizations? Or are there any key stakeholders that you work closely with that you'd want to get kind of buy-in from on the front end? So making sure you do your due diligence and get some of those key questions addressed on the front end will really make for smoother sailing as you go down the road, so you're not running into any obstacles or hiccups after the fact. Another area that really needs to be addressed is basically scoping what kind of capacity you have, what kind of expectation you have around what kind of staff time will be available to launch one of these programs. So what key staff would be working on the program? What percentage of their time is available? Is it only, a couple hours a week? Is it 20% of their time? Is it 50% of the time? What kind of capacity will you have internally? Also looking at the auditor or any other guidance, are there limits on the amount of revenue or profit, however you want to look at it, that you can generate from this kind of program? From our perspective, our auditor told us essentially that there is no rule on this from the IRS, but they counseled us to stay within a third or less of our total revenue from fee-for-service consulting to not reach a point where that revenue might be taxable. So their general guidance was about a third or less of the revenue shouldn't raise any red flags as long as it's fully within the organizational mission, which fleet analysis and planning services certainly meet that definition. So we definitely encourage any coalition looking to start this to do their due diligence along these lines. Also, on the cost structure, so when we apply for a Department of Energy grant or other state and federal grants, usually they have a very clear budgeting template where you're putting in your costs in a very specific rubric. When you quote a consulting project to a client, whether a public or private fleet, it does not make sense to use all those detailed spreadsheets that, say, the DOE would request. So what you're going to have to do is assess a effective consulting rate, is what we're calling it for these purposes. We actually, for the peer exchange and for the first deeper dive into this section, we have a multi-tab Excel sheet that's all auto-calculating so that folks can put in some key numbers about your coalition to develop a couple of different components that will roll up into that effective consulting rate. And those include a fully loaded staff rate. So, I know what my salary is personally, and I could just do a straight division to say, okay, that's about my hourly cost. But, the cost for Clean Fuels Ohio is very different than just that hourly cost. There's payroll taxes, there's health benefits, fringe, there's vacation time, any number of components that go into what could be considered a fully loaded staff cost. So there we have a worksheet, template, and exercise for folks to work through on assessing fully loaded staff rates if you've not done that already. And then there's, when you apply for federal grants, there's a whole process in which you can get a federally approved indirect rate that takes into account indirect expenses like rent and utilities and communications bills. So based on some Department of Labor guidance, we also have an exercise that'll walk coalitions through, if you haven't looked at an indirect rate for your coalition, looking at how to essentially estimate an indirect rate for your coalition so that you'll have your fully loaded staff rate. You also have a coalition indirect rate. And then the third area for these tools that we'll provide is what we're calling the effective business development cost. So, in order to secure a consulting contract, from our experience, you need to have developed marketing materials, have done some outreach, have had multiple preliminary meetings with a prospective client to get to the final. So a number of different hours put in before you've secured a contract. And so you're obviously not going to directly bill a client, past or future, for those hours, but you need to incorporate those kinds of costs into your business model. So looking at how you can account for those business development costs, those indirect costs, and those fully loaded staff costs to tie up into a fully loaded consulting rate. So that's some of the key meat that we've developed internally here and that others who have done this have. And so we have a whole set of templates and tools to walk folks through that we'll be offering at peer exchange and doing more specific kind of training and deeper on our webinar on September the 7th. And then, once you understand what your costs are, you need to figure out what your administrative structure is going to be for these kind of consulting programs. So, from our experience, not all coalitions track their time in a lot of detail. So you will need some kind of time tracking process to really figure out what's your revenue versus your cost. Did you account for your costs correctly? Did you propose your time correctly? Did the project take way more time and money than you expected, and so it's actually a loss for the coalition? Or did it, take less time, so it's actually a bigger gain, or you can be leaner and more aggressive in proposing the next project? So you need to figure out how you're going to continue to track time and review your cost versus your revenue. And then, if you are a tax-exempt nonprofit, how does any of that affect your potential tax-exempt status? And then if you do have a standard audit process, for us, our standard, we've always had a yearly audit, and when we were fully grant funded, that was a very specific type of accounting. Once we started doing consulting projects, we had to kind of develop some secondary processes with our auditor to account for revenue for projects that are underway. So for a lot of consulting projects, you're getting paid in a couple of lump sums, likely based on key work that you've performed. So how do you account for that in your normal process, that work in progress, for lack of a better word, that may not have been invoiced for or may not have been paid yet, but is still a work in progress based on the overall consulting project. All right, and again, we will circle back for question and answer at the end here, but moving on to our next course section. Basically, this section 2, as I've got it, step 2, as I've got it framed here, and step 3 are kind of parallel processes, but once you figure out how to do all your organizational structure, figure out your costs and your admin, then the next big area is scoping a project for a client, making sure you're set up to enter into contracts with the client, and then obviously performing the work. So in terms of this, really taking a close look at what your technical capacity is. We talked on the front end a little bit about what kinds of services a coalition may offer. So there's obviously a wider range of services that you could decide you want to offer. Or even if you're looking at just fleet analysis and planning services, you can kind of collapse that or expand that depending on your capacity and on your desire. So, you could look at only alternative fuels or alternative fuels plus efficiency technologies like anti-idling and other technologies. You could even expand that further if you felt you had the capacity to look at fleet management best practices. So what kind of policies can they put in place to procure the most efficient vehicles? What kind of processes can they put in place to gather the best kinds of data and analyze that data in a way that's meaningful about their operations? How can they make sure they're utilizing their vehicles, or that their replacement plan is using more nuanced metrics than perhaps just it has to be 10 years old or over 100,000 miles. There's a lot more nuanced metrics and best practices out there. So kind of what is that scope of services that you want to offer, and do you have the technical capacity and tools to offer that? And part of this conversation is you don't need to be in a position to do everything yourself to offer these services. So are there ways to utilize resources from the Department of Energy and other energy labs? There are ways to even contract with other coalitions or other stakeholders or board members or folks within your orbit that might have the technical capacity to help you execute a contract. So what kind of third-party assistance might you need, and what kind of creative avenues are there for you to get that assistance? And then obviously after you've kind of done that base level assessment internally and mapped out some of those things, you're going to need to know and have a process for proposing projects to clients. So it's all well and good to talk about consulting services on the high level, but at the end of the day, you're going to need to provide them. Here's a specific proposal with a detailed scope of work and a detailed budget. So the organizational groundwork that you lay on the front end will allow you to get close to that detailed budget, but you are going to need to propose a reasonable level of service. And I use the word reasonable there in a couple senses. One, you're going to want to be aggressive and provide a lot of value to go out and get people's business, but you're also going to want to balance that aggressiveness with what's most feasible for your coalition, either in terms of just staff time or technical capacity. So making sure you propose a reasonable scope of services that you have the capacity to execute in a timely manner, and making sure you hold the client to that. Like I said, these consulting services program often move into kind of a customer-oriented mode, which is somewhat unique from how coalitions might have operated in the past with grant funders. So, you'll get into conversations with clients where they might want to change the scope midstream or expand or have various levels of scope creep. So monitoring that as you, both on the front end and throughout the process is an essential component of this work. In addition, what kind of reporting templates do you need? Usually for us, we provide a printed report for folks that we submit to them, as well as often provide like a presentation to key stakeholders within organizations. We will be providing some basic templates for this type of deliverable, but obviously what we provide may need to be tweaked for your coalition in general or specific clients in particular. And then finally, you need to sign on the dotted line. So there's going to be a contract that says we will perform these exact services in these time frames, and there will be a contract around that. So we will also be providing, as part of this deeper dive webinar, a template for proposals, a template contract with boilerplate language approved by our law firm and genericized for anyone to utilize. But in terms of contracting, you really need to figure out, do you have the capacity to vet a contract, either one that you create and give to a client or one that a client gives back to you? For a lot of the public fleets that we've worked with, there's been standard city contracts that you have to agree to, but you need to do some legal review there and make sure that you're not agreeing to hand over intellectual property rights to the product that you create, or that you're not exposing yourself to certain or too much liability. There's also, for most of the public contracts that we've done, there's specific types of insurance that they require. These types of insurance are something that we've acquired in the process of launching our consulting programs, so we can provide some guidance on what those usually are. But as I mentioned earlier in our previous webinar today, it's not the order of magnitude of you're a design and engineering firm and there's a whole level of insurance that those types of firms need. It's a couple steps below that in terms of the general kinds of consulting that we'll be doing. So it's usually been very feasible. But doing your due diligence around having boilerplate contracts, knowing you have the capacity for legal review, whether you have that internally, whether a board member or a stakeholder can provide that, or whether you need to work with a third-party legal firm for a couple of the first ones before you get a feel for what to watch out for and how to work these types of contracts. And then finally, kind of in tandem to that in many respects, is the business development and marketing structure. So we've been very fortunate that a number of projects have project partners have sought us out to do this work for them, but that's not something that can be relied on, and that's not something that we rely on. So you really need to have a business development strategy as part of this to look at who are the target clients. Are they public fleets? Are they private fleets? Are they both? Are they a specific subcategory of fleets? Where are your expertise? Where are your key targets? What's your capacity around business development? Maybe it's limited. Maybe you can tie it into other work that you're doing. Essentially for us, we do tie, every time we present, we do mention that we have these services available. So it's important to get that word out, but also to look closely at what the cost versus benefit is in terms of how much time and effort you're going to sink into marketing or into outreach on the business development side based on expected revenues. We've often found partnerships to be key, working with associations, working with anybody who has a member base that are fleets. We've looked at creative ways to partner with those organizations to essentially use them as what we've termed here multiplier channels to get the word out to a wider audience than maybe we directly have access to. So looking at those aspects of the business development strategy, as well as then, what is the marketing and outreach plan? Do you need specific types of collateral? Do you do a lot of face-to-face meetings and want a piece of print collateral? Do you want to just have a portion of your website that has everything and reference that with folks? More or less? And then how are you going to get that word out there to people, using multiple channels like your social media, your website, your in-person meetings and events, other potential partnerships and multiplier channels like we just discussed. So we will be providing templates and tools around this aspect as well on our final deeper dive webinar. So stay tuned for more information. Hopefully join us for that. So just as a quick recap before we launch into the Q&A portion for today, we will be having a deeper dive session from 3:30 to 5 p.m. on August 24th at the Coordinator Peer Exchange on this topic. And you are asked to register by July the 26th for that session so we can plan accordingly. And then on the 7th, the 14th, and the 21st, we will go into more detail as well as review and work with you on the tools and templates that we provide for each of these following components. So again, the goal is really to get coalitions and coordinators all the groundwork laid so that whenever a client presents itself, you can move forward and work with that client and have all the structure in place so that you don't have to scramble at the last minute and get this done. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to more questions, and I'm going to jump back to our first slide for a second here and show that number. So anyone who hasn't logged in to our interactive audio portion, make sure you dial this 605 number in the passcode if you want to ask questions directly and talk with us. Otherwise, I do have access to anyone's questions via the chat portion. So with that, open it up to questions and comments. Great. I appreciate. Sure, thank you for that. We do have a couple questions on the online portion that people have chatted to us. The first question was a coordinator who's very interested in some of the additional types of fee-for-service or revenue-generating strategies listed in the introduction, so the events management and grant writing and so forth, and wanted more information on that. I'm happy to provide some of that to folks offline. We can weave a little bit more of that into here, but we have focused on the analysis and planning services, as that's a little more universal from our perspective to coalitions. Like the grant writing services, for example, is a lot more idiosyncratic based on what's available in your state or your region. Similarly, the event planning services or the government affairs services, a lot more specific to regional interests, clients, and so forth. And so that's why we've zeroed in more fully on the analysis and planning services, as there's a more universal pathway forward in that regard. I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add there, Alan. Definitely. And then at the end here, I will display the second question that we had was, is there contact information for follow-ups? I do have Sandra, Alan, and my contact information available that I'll display here at the end. Happy to continue to take questions, and it looks like a couple more are being chatted to us as well. So are there any questions while I read these next questions? Yeah, so not hearing any, I'll read some of the next questions we have here. We have a question, as a paid consultant, are we open to any liability or lawsuits for vehicle or infrastructure issues? From our perspective, I think the long story short on that is no. We are not, our goal has been to provide this basic analysis and planning service. So we are not going to the level, at least with what Clean Fuels Ohio has done to date, we have not gone to the level of this is this, we're vetting out, will a propane vehicle work for this drive and duty cycle? We're not providing detailed information on this is exactly how you convert that engine and where you bolt the system and all these miscellaneous details of conversion. We are looking for quotes of what is based on the capacity and needs of the fleet that may operate on an alternative fuel, what's the basic footprint of a station, the basic components of a station, the basic cost of a station. We're not usually going to the level of detail in terms of this is how you will actually design, spec, and build that station. So we're usually not rising to the level of liability around any of those follow-ups. So should someone choose to move forward with a conversion or deployment of a technology, they'd be working through vendors that would then take on liability should they have any issues with conversions or with the station infrastructure that they may have built for them. But that would be all handled in that course, not in the kind of consulting report on the kind of the feasibility level. Right. So to echo those comments, in terms of liability, most coalition consulting around these kinds of general feasibility, general cost effectiveness, we're looking at, will these technologies pencil out for fleets? So we're kind of one layer removed from any final functionality issues that they have once deploying. Those are usually related directly to their contracts with vehicle providers and infrastructure providers. That looks like all the questions we have online. We've got about 5 more minutes of time scheduled, so if there are any additional questions that folks want to voice or chat to us, feel free to do so. I'm happy to stay around and answer those. Well, not hearing or seeing any new questions, I think we will conclude our session for today. We hope you can join us on August the 24th for the Coordinator Peer Exchange in Golden, Colorado at NRO. And as Sandra said, please RSVP by next week if possible to get your spot there. And otherwise, hope you can join us in September for our deeper dives. This webinar we have recorded and we will make available for people to watch if other staff weren't available for the 2 times we had today. And we will also be posting our additional resources and future webinars to the SharePoint portal for continued access for coordinators. So thanks again for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you in person on August 24th and on the web in our series in September. So thanks again, everyone. Appreciate your time and look forward to working with you.